email to some of the companies in Mauritius to see if they would be interested in doing any workshops. And I've never had such a huge response from somebody. So Clem, you're a very popular person in Mauritius, I have to say. And I think this is your first visit, and it's certainly not going to be your last. For those of you who don't know Clem, he was born in Suffolk in the UK, and he was educated at Winchester College and went to Oxford, where he read politics, philosophy and economics, before joining Chartered Consolidated as a management trainee. He then moved to Lusaka, where he worked for Anglo-American Corporation, and from there was transferred to the head office of Anglo-American Corporation of South Africa. He spent most of his subsequent career in the gold and uranium division, serving as its chairman and CEO. At the time, it was the largest gold producer in the world, and he was until recently chairman of the Anglo-American Chairman's Fund, which in a recent survey was voted the premier corporate social responsibility fund in South Africa. In the early 80s, he established a scenario planning function in Anglo, and really from this has developed into an expert in scenario planning. He has authored many books on the subject, and more recently a trilogy, I think, called Mind Like a Fox. I think some of you have read it or are in the process of reading it. Sorry, Fox trilogy, there you are, the Fox trilogy. Two highlights for Clem have been a presentation to F.W. de Klerk in the Cabinet in 1986, and a visit to Nelson Mandela in prison to discuss the future just before his release. He was recently awarded an honorary doctorate by the University of Cape Town for his work in the field of scenario planning, and he's also been voted by leading South African CEOs as the speaker who has made the most significant contribution to and impact on best practice and business in South Africa. I think without more ado, I'll pass you over to Clem, who's going to be talking to us about global scenarios for the global economy. Clem, over to you.
Everybody, I don't like standing up and looking down on you, so I'm going to talk from here. Just one other thing that I wasn't in my CV, because I don't put it there officially, but before I joined Anglo, I was in a rock band in the UK. And one of the things which I really remember best was I spent 3 months in Paris with one of the bands. And we used to busk at Saint-Germain-en-Laye. We did the cinema views. We used to sing songs by Johnny Hallyday, François Hardy, Tous les garçons sous les filles, and Richard Anthony, J'entends siffler le train. And yeah, then we went to a restaurant called, which was called L'Auberge Notre Dame. It was actually just opposite Notre Dame. And its main clientele were Americans, and we passed ourselves off as French, so we called les garçons at this thing. And then we used to ask these Americans what they would like to sing, and they used to say, "Oh, can you sing the Yellow Rose of Texas?" And we say, "Oh, oui, the Yellow Rose of Texas." And then we used to do it with a very, the best French accent we could, and they used to give us $10. So yeah. I want to do two things for you. Before we get on to the global scenarios, I want to talk to you about how, with a young woman called Chantal Ilbery, we've modified the whole methodology of scenario planning to try and make it more user-friendly for people in business. Then I want to show you how it works with the global economy, and then I'd like to show you how, when you consider a country, how you can analyze the country's prospects using the technique. The story starts in the early 1980s. We decided to start a process of scenario planning in Anglo-American because rather than trying to forecast things like the gold price, we realized that it was totally impossible to do that. And we heard that Royal Dutch Shell in London used this technique called scenario planning to play different possibilities for the oil market in the 1970s, and they very cleverly captured the oil price shocks in the 1970s, not by predicting them, but by writing stories about them. So we asked the head of the team a Frenchman called Pierre Wack. He was a very clever Frenchman. He won the Prix d'Or at École Polytechnique in France. So he was one of the brightest students there. And he was probably the world's greatest scenario planner at the time when he headed Shell. And we asked him to Johannesburg to give us a presentation on how the technique worked. And we were totally blown away by his presentation as Anglo-American, the company I worked for. And so we asked him to become a consultant because he was just about to retire from Shell. And so I had the great fortune as the coordinator of the discipline to work with one of the great futurists of the last half of the last century. And he did the job. He worked until about 93. And in the mid-1980s, we used the technique of scenario planning to play different scenarios for South Africa. We had one which was called the high road of negotiation between the National Party, which was the government at the time, and the ANC, to negotiate a new political dispensation for South Africa, which would get us back into the world economy. And we had the low road, where it was confrontation, it was civil war, and South Africa became a wasteland. And I was then asked to give public presentations in 1986. And at the time, a lot of people said they didn't understand how Anglo could send a fairly well-paid manager like me on the road to spin a fairy tale, because there was absolutely no way that the National Party would ever sit down with the ANC and negotiate a new constitution. And it just shows the power of the process, because we could never have forecasted, but we could write a story, and actually it became reality far sooner than our team actually thought. We thought the late 1990s was when people would start being sensible, instead of which they became sensible in the late 80s, and with Nelson Mandela's release in 1990, the whole process of negotiating a new constitution got underway. So it absolutely showed that this type of approach to look at the future could capture something which was very remote as a possibility when we put it forward. But it changed the conversation. People started talking about the high road. I actually gave a presentation, as was said, to the cabinet, F.W. de Klerk in the cabinet at the time. I went and saw Nelson Mandela in prison just before his release. And yeah, it did what scenario planning is supposed to do. It exposed people to different possibilities, which in the end became reality. And of course, the great thing about scenario planning is if it hadn't become reality, I could have said it was just a scenario. So you can be more extreme when you write scenarios. However, and this is the big however, when Pierre finally retired as consultant in 1993, the whole process just died in Anglo-American, because a lot of our mine managers and others just didn't see the relevance of the technique for their strategy work in their business units. And it was only in the year 2000 when I was sent a thesis by a student at University of Cape Town Graduate School of Business. Her thesis was on scenario planning, and she wanted me to look at it before she submitted it to her professor. Her name was Chantal Aubry. And she made 2 points in her thesis which really resonated with me, having had the experience of looking after this discipline in Anglo. She said, firstly, it was far too intellectual and abstract a technique to appeal to ordinary business people, particularly to entrepreneurs and small businesses. And I could vouch for that. When I used to go to London in the 1980s to compare the Anglo scenarios with the Royal Dutch Shell scenarios at their offices overlooking the Thames, I used to say to the concierge on the ground floor, can you please direct me to the scenario planning team? And he'd wink at me and say, you mean the priests of the Nile? In other words, they were seen as an elite bunch of futurists who were totally out of touch with the operational management of Shell. So we've done 2 things to try and close that gap. Firstly, we now put as much effort into identifying the flags that would indicate that you're moving from one scenario to another. as we do into writing the scenarios themselves. Because it's like if you give people a map of roads and you don't give them signposts, that's what scenarios are without flags. So we feel very strongly that you've got to not only give a theme for a possible future, you've got to say these are the flags that if they rise would suggest that we're moving into that particular future. And then the second thing is, based on whether the flags are going up or down, you have to assign a probability to the scenario. You can't just say it's more likely, less likely, because that really doesn't help, it's too general. So we give a figure of a probability to a scenario, but it is a subjective probability. We've actually had discussions with MIT, who are probably the world's great experts on probability theory, and they may well be able to link our flags to the probabilities using a mathematical model, but it's simply beyond our capability, and so we give our best shot using our instinct as to what the probability of a scenario is based on the flags. So that was the first point Chantal made, make the whole process more user-friendly. The second point she made, which was even more important, she said you can't just look at scenarios. That's daydreaming. You've got to look at the consequences of the scenarios for you, for your family, for your business. And then based on the impact and the probability, you've got to decide what you're going to do about it. You've got to decide whether you're going to do something now to chase the opportunities or counter the threats, or you've got to have a contingency plan so that if the probability increases, you've got a prepared plan of action for that scenario. You've got to connect all the dots. So I said to Chantal, forget about your thesis, we must write a book together, and it took us 5 months, and we published it in June 2001, and we called it The Mind of a Fox. Now we chose that title because of a Greek poet who in 650 BC wrote the following line: the hedgehog knows one big thing, whereas the fox knows many little things. Now why he chose those two animals, heaven only knows, and he's been dead for a long time. But we just thought it was a very good way to contrast our technique with what was being taught, particularly at American business schools and in American management textbooks, which is you've got to have a vision for your business, which is the hedgehog big idea. Support it with a mission statement. Align everybody, I love that word, align everybody and march collectively towards the mission. Now there's nothing wrong with that, because Peter Drucker introduced management by objectives in the 1950s, and we've run businesses and other organizations on setting objectives. And indeed, if you read Good to Great by Jim Collins, he has a whole chapter devoted to the hedgehog concept and trying to exclude everything else but the importance of the vision. The problem comes when the future assumed in the vision turns out to be incorrect, and you're marching everybody in that direction, and the future's going off in that direction. And yeah, that's when things can go seriously wrong. And that's where you need the foxes. Because foxes, like the animals, are natural lookers out. They look at the environment, they see how it's changing. And it's their response to the changes in the environment that allows them to survive. And we feel any business to be in business for a long time maybe needs the visionary hedgehog to set the initial objective of the company, but then you need the foxes to actually watch out, see how the environment is changing for that business, and then adapt the strategy of the business. And so that's why we wrote The Mind of a Fox, is to give people that point of view that you've got to look out before you look in. When the book first came out, it wasn't that successful because books on scenario planning never are. But then something happened which turned it into an overnight hit, and it was the best-selling book of any time in South Africa in 2002, and in 2003 it was number 2 because Harry Potter was number 1. So what was the event that propelled it into the bestsellers? It was 9/11, because what we decided to do in the book was publish a letter to George Bush in which we said that part of his legacy as the President of the United States would be determined by the speed and quality of his response to certain extreme futures that might come his way. And we nominated as his #1 threat a massive terrorist strike on an American city which would completely transform his presidency and possibly lead America into a gilded cage where it shut itself off from the rest of the world. And it happened 3 months after we published the book. Thank heavens we didn't get it exactly right. We didn't have planes flying into buildings. If we had, I wouldn't be here in Mauritius. I'd be in Cuba. We talked to somebody planting a nuclear device in the middle of an American city. We talked of nuclear terrorism. The letter, you can actually read it on our website on the internet. But what we got right were the 3 flags that made us elevated to #1. The first flag was the growing confrontation between the major religions of the world in the early 90s, which we felt, was a kind of a prelude to some form of hostility, particularly Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. The second flag was the re-equipping of organizations dedicated to the downfall of America in the mid-90s in places like Afghanistan. But the flag that clinched it for us was the 2 attacks by Al-Qaeda on American embassies in Africa in 1998, one in Kenya and one in Tanzania, which we felt was a prelude for the real thing in America. And I mean, I just sent shivers down my spine seeing this appalling incident that happened at the Westgate shopping centre in Nairobi. I just hope that that isn't a prelude for something, in London or in New York, and it's kind of rehearsal. So that's overnight we became quite big celebrities because we were the only book published anywhere in the world that actually, in a letter to the president, nominated this as his principal threat. We suddenly got lots of invitations to help organizations around the world to look at fairly extreme scenarios, examine the flags, consider the probabilities, and then look at the sequence of decisions that you make in the event that those scenarios materialize. Probably the most interesting session that I've ever done was at a place called the Central Party School. It's the inner sanctum of the Chinese Communist Party. It's based outside Beijing, where it's their leadership academy. It was founded by Mao Zedong after the Long March. And they formulated 5-year plans in China, and they took a liking to our technique because obviously they like to road test their plan against possible global economic scenarios that could derail them. And so in April 2006, I introduced the technique to them, and that afternoon they actually wrote a scenario of an American crash and what they would do in the event of a decline in Chinese exports to America and how they'd have to expand the internal economy to make up for the loss of exports, and how there could be competition between the yuan and the dollar, and then finally there could be a trade war between America and China. And in retrospect, it was far better for them to go through that sequence of decisions in the sort of cool light of day of 2006 than making them in the heat of the moment when the actual crash happened in 2008. Last year, in July, I was asked by many of the commercial banks in Europe, the big banks in Europe, to go to a place called Lake Constance in Switzerland, outside Zurich, to look at euro breakup scenarios, because obviously they were concerned that their principal currency is the euro, and if suddenly you had drachmas and all other kinds of currencies, how would they handle their deposits? And interestingly, they played a scenario where the first out of the eurozone was not Greece, it was Germany. It was the Germans being fed up with their club bed neighbours who were sort of, spending too much money on credit and all that kind of stuff. And so we looked at what happens if, you suddenly go back to Deutschmarks, you suddenly go back to all the other currencies in Europe. And at least they've done the work now, so that if it ever happens, they have a better idea of what to do. The other flags that we really discuss with businesses that we do work for are the flags that are changing their business game. Because there is a huge difference between sport and business. Sport like tennis, golf, rugby, cricket, soccer is very much like it was 50 years ago. But most business games change dramatically in a period of 5 to 10 years. And if you're not aware of those changes and looking at the flags that are causing those changes, you can basically go under as a business. And one of the most terrible things is the more successful you are as a business, the more you have invested in a particular game, the more blind you are to the flags that are changing. When IBM was the #1 company in the world in the early 80s, they invented the personal computer. But they didn't take advantage of it. It was Dell Computers and others that took advantage of it because they thought the mainframe game would go on forever. Kodak invented the device that killed it, which was the digital camera. They thought the film camera would go on forever, and so they never invested enough money in digital cameras. Kodak now is an empty brain. I personally think the next company on the execution block is Intel, because Intel makes chips for a dying device, which is the PC. Because more and more people now are downloading information on their smartphone devices rather than on PCs, and you do specialized work on a PC. So you have to consider the flags that are changing your business game. I did a session in London at the beginning of last year with one of America's top credit card companies. It's actually very funny because we held it at the Carlton Club, which is a very sort of gentleman's club, sort of thing. And the CEO of the company turned up in jeans, but he wasn't allowed through the front door. So he had to come in through the kitchen. Anyway, we had about 30 people, mainly Americans and Brits, but we had this one Kenyan. And that intrigued me until he opened his mouth. And then I realized that he was a flag. Because he was the founder of the M-Pesa system in Kenya, where instead of paying with a credit card or cash, you use your mobile phone, your cell phone, to pay. You have your part of your bank balance credited to the phone, and when you go to the checkout counter, you put in your code, your phone gets swiped, your balance goes down, the shop's balance goes up. And the average Kenyan citizen loves the idea because he doesn't have to make sure he's got the right credit card, and it's certainly more secure than cash. And the average shop likes it because they're not paying the same level of commission to the credit card company. And within 30 seconds of his opening his mouth, I realized what scenario they were playing, which is in 10 to 15 years' time. Credit cards will go the way of checks, something you don't use. And their game would disappear. And now comes the foxy side. In November last year, I had to do a strategy session in Cape Town for a company called Fundamo, F-U-N-D-A-M-O, which is the leading developer of software to turn mobile phone into an electronic wallet. And before I started, the CEO took me to one side and he said, I have to tell you something, and we've just been taken over 100% by this credit card company. So they were foxes. They didn't just play the scenario, they actually made sure that they got a foot in the new game. If Americans start using cell phones as electronic wallets and replace credit cards. So we feel it's very important in a strategy session to really look at your business game and how it's changing, and to consider whether you are adapting your strategy to those changes, because they're beyond your control. There are some companies which feel that they can control the game, but there are very few examples where it works. You have to adapt to the changing reality of your game. So what are we saying right now to our global clients about the global economy? Well, the first scenario we offer them we call hard times. It's titled to a Charles Dickens book. It's not a double dip, it's just low, flat world economy till at least 2020. So in other words, it's just flat. And we think it's a credible scenario for two reasons. Number one, we had a long boom between 1982 and 2007. We had 25 years when you couldn't help but make money. But the problem was the second half of that boom was artificial because it was really created by credit. And governments started borrowing too much, individuals borrow too much. I remember a statistic in London, and I think it was 2005, that the average British teenager had 11 credit cards and circulated the balances. Now, it all had to come to an end, and it did in 2008, and obviously now people are having to rectify their financial affairs, and this is acting as a drag on the global economy, because most governments, particularly, are having to introduce austerity measures to balance their budgets. But there is a second reason, which is even more powerful than the first reason, and it comes from a session that we did in London as the Anglo Scenario team in September 1988. And the opening speaker was Pierre Wack, this legendary Frenchman. And he said, at this presentation, the flags have gone up on Japan. Now, I can promise you, in 1988, we all thought of Japan like we think about China today. It was unstoppable. We were even studying Japanese management techniques to try and copy what they were doing. And he was here saying the party's over. But he did have a Japanese wife, so we listened. He said the first flag, and this shows how bizarre a flag can be, he said, is declining golf club membership in Tokyo. He said Japanese are resigning from golf clubs in Tokyo, and they are fanatics, and something serious must be happening to their disposable income. And he said that combined with the absurd value of property in Japan in 1988, the Emperor's Palace in Tokyo was worth more than the entire state of California. He said means that there's going to be a property crash next year, and that's going to bring down the whole economy. Anyway, the only thing he was wrong about was timing. It didn't actually happen in 1989. It happened at the beginning of 1990. I mean, some of you may have forgotten that in December 1990, the Nikkei index almost touched 40,000. It's 15,000 this morning on Bloomberg. So, you know, you'd have lost a lot of money if you'd invested in Japan in the late 80s. But it was his second flag that was relevant to today, because he made a very strong statement. He said, when they crash, they will never recover. Now that is a very strong statement to make about the future. But 23 years later, he's been proved right. The Japanese have thrown everything at their economy. They have the highest national debt to GDP ratio in the world, 230%. And you still haven't seen the kind of growth rates that you saw in the 70s and 80s. So what was Pierre's second flag? He said it's the aging of Japan. He said they're about to enter a geriatric boom. And yes, if you sell walking sticks and hearing aids and anti-wrinkle cream, good for business, but not for anything else. Old people don't eat as much. And they also don't innovate as much. And he said the golden era of innovation in Japan is probably over, because the critical segment for innovation is the 25 to 40-year-old age group. And that is declining as a proportion of the overall Japanese population. And you have to say that the early 80s, they were on a roll with zero-defect vehicles, just-in-time inventories, the Walkman, computer games. And yeah, they haven't had that role recently. Now, why is this relevant to today? It's because the world's largest economy, which is not America, it's actually Europe collectively, has even worse demographics than Japan had in 1988. You put a roof over an English village, it's an old age home. But much worse, Italy is the first nation in the history of mankind to have a naturally declining population for the last 7 years. It's not because of epidemics, it's not because of war, it's because they have a very, very low birth rate. And yeah, remarkable for a Roman Catholic country. That's probably why the Pope resigned. But there it is. How do you grow your business in a country when there are fewer people in it? And indeed, a lot of Italian students at university are studying German. When they finish their degree, they can hop across the border to Germany. So, it's not just Italy. Unfortunately, the whole of Europe is aging, seriously aging. And Germany may be able to still buck the trend because they are a world-class economy. But essentially what we're saying is, if you believe that demographics are a huge influence over a country's medium-term economic prospects, then it doesn't matter what the Central Bank of Europe does, the European Central Bank. However much money it throws at the European economy, it's just going to remain flat. America's in better shape. America has a younger population. The critical age group, which is the 35 to 45 age group, is growing. They have more generous immigration. They have a respectable birth rate in their Latino and black population. And so America, if it flatlines, could be in the 2 to 3% economic growth rate range, whereas Europe probably will be in the 0 to 1% range, with the exception of Germany. So what do we say to our companies we work for about how you grow your business in hard times? Well, the answer is you have to have an intelligent strategy. And we found that there are 3 broad alternatives you can use to grow a business in hard times. Number 1 is innovation. You have to have a regular new product or service that you offer to the public, say once a year. It's like smart devices from Apple. You've got to have a culture of innovation in your business. And what's more, you've got to reward the employees that come up with really bright ideas. In Anglo American, my company, which is a mining company, we were a family business, and we were founded by a man called Sir Ernest Oppenheimer. And when the geologists in the 1920s found a new deposit, he paid them a large bonus. I mean, Hans Merensky, who found the Platinum Reef, which is the largest platinum reef in the world, was paid £1 million in 1925. I mean, that was a lot of money. Nowadays, our geologists are just any other employees. They're part of a particular job grade, and that's it. They don't get bonuses. So guess what? They don't find anything. So you've got to have that kind of spirit of innovation, and you've got to have a remuneration system which backs it up. That's the first way to grow your business in hard times. The second way is to live your brand to a point that convinces your customers that you offer value for money. And it's not just about clever advertising, it's about how your frontline staff interact with the public. That intensifies the points that you want to make in your brand to differentiate yourself from your competitors. A lot of American companies do this very successfully, whereas a lot of European and South African companies don't, because they just think it's yucky to actually have kind of formal rules of engagement. I've just done a roadshow around South Africa with the #1 estate agency in South Africa. And it was Pan Golding for a long time, but it's just been overtaken by Remax. And Remax is an American estate agency. It wasn't even in South Africa 15 years ago, and it is now up to #1. It's sold 15 billion rands worth of property in South Africa last year, whereas Pan Golding was 14 billion. And when I did this roadshow with Remax, I discovered why. They are passionate about the rules of engagement that their estate agents, who are franchisees in the business, have with the public to intensify the Remax brand. That if you want to buy or sell your house, you're going to get, the best price from putting your house with Remax. So the second alternative is much more intense brand management, where you live the brand. I did a session with a hotel chain the other day, and they just sent out a consumer survey to people who repeated their visits to the same hotel. And they asked what was the principal reasons for doing so. And they were gobsmacked by the results, because they thought it would be the quality of their food or the softness of their pillows. It wasn't. You know what it was? It was the warmth of greeting at reception. And I just think of most South African hotels where they say, "Can I have your credit card?" The very first words they utter. That's the second alternative. The third alternative is to be the cheaper alternative. Basically, to have a price structure that is the best in the market. And the problem with that, of course, it can precipitate a price war. But on the other hand, it can be a very successful model when people are being forced to buy down. In South Africa, we have a clothing chain called Mr. Price. And you have it here in Mauritius. Well, I did a session with Mr. Price about 2 years ago in their Durban offices. And I always remember one of the managers there saying, there's no such thing as a high net worth housewife left in South Africa. So they all come to Mr. Price with their Edgar's or Woolworths bags. And I perished the thought, you don't show people that you're going to Mr. Price. You just go and secretly buy their clothes and stick them in a Woolworths bag. But I mean, Mr. Price has grown its revenue at something like 17 or 18% per annum since 2008, because people are being forced to buy that. You don't go and buy your golf shirt at a professional shop. You go and buy it at Mr. Price for a third of the price because you have to do that now. So there you go. We've connected the dots. You have to do one of those three things in hard times, something completely new. Brand management to convince your customers you offer value for money, or the cheaper alternative. But it's not our only scenario that we offer our clients. We offer one other mainframe scenario. We call it ultraviolet, UV, where the old world economies with the aging populations have the long U, and the new world economies with the younger populations have a V-like recovery and grow at least 3 times faster than the old world economies. And if you ask me what most multinational companies believe in now, it's that second scenario. So guess what? They're all over Africa like a rash, trying to enter most African markets. I mean, the World Bank has just come out with a statistic that even made my eyebrows rise, which is that right now, of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world, 7 are in Africa, and only 3 are outside Africa in the world. And obviously, these countries are coming off a low base, but they're growing at 7%, 8%, 9%, which is very high by world standards today. And the whole image of Africa has changed as a result from what the economists in 2000 called the hopeless continent, to a continent of immense commercial opportunity because of its younger demographics now. So what is the strategy in that second scenario? The strategy is very simple. You have to chase the V. You have to chase the V in Africa, but you've got to chase it elsewhere in the world where you have younger demographics. What is the principal flag that we have between hard times for everybody and this 2-speed ultraviolet world? It's China. If China continues to grow 8 to 10% per annum, then obviously all the countries supplying China, which are mainly emerging economies, will grow fast too, particularly countries in Africa like Angola and Nigeria and Sudan, which supply China with oil. But if China has a kind of Japanese moment, like what happened in 1990, and falls below 5% economic growth, then obviously it'll be hard times for everybody. And I have to say, we've gone slightly more negative on China's economic prospects in the medium term than we were a year ago, for 3 reasons. Number one, China faces a demographic cliff of note because of its one-child policy that it introduced in 1978. And indeed, if you look at the demographic structure of China in 15 years' time, where you have 0 to 100 years old on the vertical axis, and you have male-female on the horizontal axis, you see that the pyramid, which you normally have in a country where you have more younger people than old people, opens up into a rectangle, where you have equal numbers of people in each age group. And if you look 20 years ahead, China becomes the first country ever to have more people over 50 than under 50. And that could create serious problems for the Chinese economy. Now, I know that they've relaxed the one-child policy to a certain extent, and if you pay a certain sum of money, you can have a second child. But unfortunately, demographics can't change the kind of structure that you built for yourself over the next 10 or 15 years. The only way they could combat it is through much more generous immigration policies, and I'm not sure that the Chinese would want to do that. The second point about China is it's turning into a more expensive economy. And a whole lot of Chinese companies are relocating their factories to Vietnam, because Vietnam is China's China. And it is. It means that they're going to have to move from replication of Western ideas to innovation. And as the Japanese themselves find, innovation is a much, much tougher game than replication. And then the third point about China is that a lot of the municipalities have borrowed money from the banks to build new suburbs. And in the old days, people moved in very quickly. Now they're not moving in quite so quickly, and we just think there could be pressure on property prices, not in Shanghai and Beijing, but in other cities of 10 to 15 million people in China. So right now, we give a 60% probability for hard times over the rest of this decade, and we give a 40% probability to the two-speed ultraviolet world. But what we say to our companies that we consult for is bet on both scenarios. The probabilities are close enough for you to offer something new, live your brand, be the cheaper alternative if it's hard times, but chase the beat in emerging markets at the same time. There's nothing contradictory in pursuing both strategies at the same time. What do we say about a country? Because it's not just companies that compete, nations compete. I mean, there's a World Competitiveness Survey that comes out of Switzerland every year in May from the International Institute for Management Development. And it's quite clear that if you want to offer a better life for the citizens of your country, you have to be competitive. And so we offer 3 scenarios to South Africans, but they're just as relevant for any other nation. The first one we call Premier League, because we like to get across to people that it is a competitive situation. And that if you want to, firstly, be part of the Premier League and you want to rise up the table of the Premier League, you're going to have to make sure that you are selling the rest of the world stuff that they want at a reasonable price. Otherwise, you're not going to offer a better life to your own citizens. So that's the sort of virtuous scenario. The second scenario is where a nation doesn't get that point and it stays in the second division, as we call it. It's where you're peaceful, you're poor, and companies still make money, but you're not raising your ranking in the World League of Nations by being in the second division. We then have another scenario, which I have to say Mauritius is definitely not in, because you have a level of social harmony here, and you're a sufficiently small population to have a unity of spirit here, but which we call failed state. It's where essentially you're anarchic, you're so anarchic that you basically fall off the screen, and nobody wants to invest in you because you're too unpredictable and you're too violent. Kind of countries that are in the failed state are Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia. You're essentially off people's radar screen. And I have to just tell you the flags which we came across just over a year ago, because we did sessions with the American Embassy in Pretoria and also with the British Embassy in Pretoria. And we asked them both, did you foresee the Arab Spring? And they both said no. So then we asked, what were the flags you missed? And they gave us 3 flags, and they were pretty much identical. Number 1, they said, abnormally high youth unemployment in the countries affected by the Arab Spring, combined with a growing discontent amongst young people for the government of the day, combined with active social networks. And they said, if you have those preconditions, then your probability of becoming a failed state rises. And I have to say, in South Africa, when I give the talk right now, I tell the public in South Africa we have all 3 preconditions in South Africa. And we're seeing a level of mayhem in our workforce that we have never seen before. We have inter-union rivalry. We have big projects like the Medupi Power Station on the Botswana border, which simply don't have any construction activity on site for 4 months because of labour unrest. And so we make a big point of saying to people in South Africa, how are we going to keep the red flags down? What are we going to do to bring down youth unemployment in South Africa? As I said, I don't think that scenario applies in any way to Mauritius. I would give it a 0 probability. But we're left with Premier League and Second Division. And we have 3 flags that we say you should watch to decide whether you are going up into the Premier League or down into the Second Division. The first flag is inclusive leadership. We looked at nations that have done well in the Premier League, and invariably they have leaders that bring the nation together as a coherent team. The example we always quote is Singapore, which after the Second World War was a basket case. In came Lee Kuan Yew, put a huge emphasis on education and law and order. This year Singapore is ranked number 5 in the Premier League. It's the same in soccer. It's very hard for me to say this as a Chelsea supporter. We did win last night. But the best manager the Premier League has ever had is Alex Ferguson. Why? Because he kept Manchester United united. We had a leader like that in South Africa, in Nelson Mandela. I mean, as was mentioned, I had the privilege of seeing him one-on-one in jail for 5 hours, and it just blew me away. And when he came out, he certainly never let me down when he was president of the country. He was absolutely brilliant at making South Africans feel that they were at one. And to be honest, we will only remain in the Premier League if we can find somebody who's not going to be the same as Nelson Mandela. There's only one Nelson Mandela, but somebody who has the same style of leadership. Because if you're a divided team as a country, you cannot possibly stay in the Premier League. So that's our number 1 flag. Look at the leadership, decide what the caliber of the leadership is. Is that leadership bringing the nation together or not? The second flag for us is how a country treats its pockets of excellence. Because every country has pockets of excellence. One of the reasons I love coming to Mauritius is you do have lots of pockets of excellence in Mauritius. In South Africa, even the government has one pocket of excellence. It's called SARS, the South African Revenue Service. It's actually a world-class revenue collection agency. And yeah, it does the job. It's just that the government doesn't spend the money properly. But it certainly is collected properly. And the question is, how do you replicate the brilliance of SARS into other government departments? And it's a similar deal in Mauritius, any country. How do you take your pockets of excellence and replicate the brilliance of those pockets of excellence? What you mustn't do is dumb your pockets of excellence down. And if there's one area where this really applies, it's in education. If you want to look at the long-term prospects of a country, you look at its education system and you see how it treats its really good schools and its really good universities. Why is Germany the number 1 nation in Europe right now, having lost the Second World War? Answer, it has the best education system in Europe, because you not only have academic education, you have technical education of the highest quality in Europe. They've made sure that they've kept their centres of excellence in education. So that for us is the second flag. How does a nation treat its pockets of excellence? The third flag is, how do you create a balanced economy? An outward economy that earns enough foreign exchange to pay for your imports, and an inward economy that creates jobs. As far as the outward economy is concerned, you have to play to your strengths. And I would be saying to you guys, what is it that Mauritius can export to the rest of the world where you can really dominate? And I think you're beginning to get a good idea. For example, being the gateway into Africa, I think is a very smart idea, because, as I said, lots of companies are now chasing the lead in Africa, and if they can come via Mauritius in terms of finances and other things like that, very, very smart move. Obviously, another area which is of interest to us in South Africa, but obviously to you in Mauritius, is tourism. Is how do you make sure that you become the tourist destination of note? And I have to say, one of the things about South Africa is because of the devaluation of the rand, it has become the cheap alternative. So we have been discovered by One Nation. I was on a packed 747 at lunchtime, going from Johannesburg to Cape Town. Totally packed aircraft, and I was the only non-Chinese passenger on the entire aircraft. So it was obviously an incredibly large party on their way from Beijing to see the penguins in Simonstown. We have a resort in South Africa called Sun City. And the last two occasions I've been there, it was very noticeable that half the people staying there, when you go and have breakfast, are Chinese. So I said to one of the managers, why? He said, we have two things that the Chinese guests like. We have wildlife, and we have a casino. He said, we're Macau with lions. So, yeah. I mean, obviously, in your case too, I know that you know the number of Chinese visiting Mauritius has risen, and yeah, you should be obviously doing everything you can to make yourself a desirable destination for people from the east as well as the west. And then, of course, there's agriculture. You've got to look at what products you can produce, which even with your long list of logistical chains, because you are a little island in the middle of the sea, you know, how can you be competitive, you know, given that the price of oil has risen, and. I mean, we have the same things when we do any work for companies with New Zealand links in New Zealand. They're having a terrible problem now in New Zealand maintaining the competitiveness of their milk powder and other things because of the cost of sea freight rising so much. So you've got to consider all these things when you choose the prime areas you can make foreign exchange. On the inward economy, we have one flag. And it is probably the most important thing I'm going to say to you today. It's a nation's attitude to its entrepreneurs. We looked at China and America, the two largest economies in the world. They can't be more different except for one thing. They both recognize the importance of their entrepreneurs. When I did this session at the Central Party School, because they have very few foreigners who are allowed on the campus, in fact I was told I was the third. The first was a Mao Zedong's doctor who followed him around, who was French. They were a bit worried about who the second was, which made me worried as the third. But anyway, one of the things I noticed in the classrooms is that they've taken down all the slogans of Mao Zedong and replaced them with slogans of Deng Xiaoping. So even though Mao's portrait hangs in Tiananmen Square, the spiritual leader of the Chinese Communist Party is now Deng Xiaoping. So I said to one of the professors, why? He said, because Deng taught us to retreat from the economy and allow the entrepreneurs, international and local, to create wealth for themselves, because we knew we would share in that wealth creation. At the time, we were the 100th ranked economy in the world, and now we're number 5. That was in 2006, and of course now China is number 2. America's always had a love affair with its entrepreneurs, ever since Henry Ford produced the Model T. And more recently, Steve Jobs, the late Steve Jobs. If you read the encomiums he got in the American press, he thought it was the death of a president. Because Americans know that if you don't have people like that, America can't stay number 1. And the other thing that Americans realize is that no company stays number 1 forever, and therefore you've got to replace your entrepreneurs. When IBM was number 1 in 1980, Microsoft didn't exist. When Microsoft was number 1 in 1999, Apple was an early brand. Now Apple recently was number 1. There's some entrepreneur burrowing away in a San Francisco garage who's going to be number 1 in 30 or 40 years' time. They know that they're only going to stay the number 1 economy on earth if they rotate their entrepreneurs. Unfortunately, in South Africa, we have a very ambivalent attitude to entrepreneurs. As one international investor said to me in Johannesburg the other day, in other countries they roll out the red carpet for it. In South Africa they roll out the red tape. We have entrepreneurs who are totally paralyzed by the bureaucracy. We have a terrible payment culture towards small business, 60 or 90 days, when cash flow is absolutely essential for a small business. We have labour regulations which make any entrepreneur scared to take on extra people because they don't want to spend a week in front of what we call the CCMA, arguing their case against a dismissal. We have something called business banking in South Africa, but if you ask any township entrepreneur whether they can access credit from a bank, they'll say no, because we don't have a security of the salary or security of assets to actually get the loan. So I'm afraid to say we are way behind in creating what I call an entrepreneurial culture in South Africa to create a new generation of enterprises. I keep saying to people in South Africa that you want to create 5 million jobs, which is the target by 2020, you've got to create 1 million new enterprises. Because that's the only way you're going to create 5 million jobs. Big business is never going to do it because most big businesses have changed their employment model. They only hire people for core activities and they subcontract all the non-core stuff out. Public works programs are temporary. Yes, you can build roads, but they're temporary. They don't offer people permanent employment. And of course, just expanding the civil service means that you've got to up your taxes. So, critically, in the world that we live in today, you want to create jobs, you've got to do everything to support the entrepreneurs in your country. Even Britain is coming to that conclusion. I mean, I've listened to Ed Miliband yesterday. I've never heard a Labour leader at a conference talk about small business. But he did, because he knows that it's the only way to be employed. And I have to say that it is amazing that schools have not come to this conclusion. They simply teach their pupils for the job market that existed 60 years ago. They're still hedgehogs. They haven't realized, like foxes, that if you look at the job market, most jobs these days are in small business, small enterprise, but no school at the moment teaches kids how to be entrepreneurs, personal brand management, how to turn an idea into commercial reality and all that stuff. Well, I'm just saying that you need that now, big time, and I would love to know in Mauritius whether you have real support for the entrepreneurs in Mauritius. I mean, I met, when I say met, I encountered many over the last few days because I've been walking the streets of Port Louis. And there are plenty of entrepreneurs in Port Louis, particularly Chinatown. And how do you obviously use that to sort of grow the next generation of entrepreneurs? Some of them will become world-class businesses. That's the whole point. And I have to say that one other strong thing you have in Mauritius, which is repeated in Germany, is family business. I think people don't understand that Germany's success after the Second World War has been largely due to the family businesses in Germany. And so family business is also a very important wave in sort of the new businesses. I'd like to end with a story which I know my wife is going to kill me for afterwards because she hears it every time. But I want to talk about one pocket of excellence in South Africa that we have, which just shows you that you do have pockets of excellence. I was the chairman of the Anglo-American Scholarship Committee for 25 years, and we interviewed the brightest students in South Africa for one open scholarship to university. And in 2008, we interviewed the brightest student we've ever had in front of our panel. This guy was just 17 years old. He got 8 straight A's in matric when he was 16. He got a scholarship to St. John's College, which is a very elite private school in Johannesburg, when he was 50. He comes from Umtata in the Eastern Cape, and his name is Siubelela Zuza. And the question we put to him is, what degree have you chosen and why? He said, I've chosen chemical engineering at University of Cape Town because I developed this passion for chemicals when I was 12 years old. I started mixing them in my mother's kitchen, causing minor explosions to our husband's lab. And then I focused on a project which was to create a rocket fuel that was more energy intensive than the stuff NASA uses to propel its rockets into outer space. I managed to do that in 2 years, and yes, I assembled a South African team. We built a rocket, I put in my fuel, and we beat the South African amateur altitude record. The project was entered into the Eskom Science show, and we won the award for technology and innovation, as well as the award for the best project of the year. He was 16 when he won those two awards. One of the prizes, he said, was to be sent to Sweden to meet the King and Queen of Sweden and to attend the Nobel Prize giving ceremony. And the opportunity arose there to enter the largest junior science competition in the world, which is held annually in America under the auspices of Intel. Not only did I win 2 awards in that competition, the organizers were so impressed by my field that they sent it to the Lincoln Laboratory, which is affiliated to NASA, who promptly named the minor planet after me. I mean, I'm sure there's nobody in this room that knows that a 17-year-old black South African has a minor planet named after him by NASA for the advances he's made to rocketry science. And when we rang NASA to confirm this story, they said, not only did we give this young gentleman the award, we haven't handed it out many times in the history of NASA. And we think he's the first student in the world to have won this award. Now, can you imagine if it had been an American student, Canadian student, French, German, Italian, Japanese, Australian student, he'd be a household name in his country of origin. In South Africa, nobody's heard of Siyabulela Zuza. They've heard of Julius Malema, but not Siyabulela Zuza. Now comes the crunch. 3 months after we awarded him the scholarship, he comes running up to me at ORT and says, "Hey, Mr. Santa, remember me?" I said, "Sia, I'm never going to forget you." He said, "You haven't heard?" So I said, "No." He said, "Harvard University have awarded me an open scholarship, all expenses paid. So you can have your scholarship back." So he's now had his 4 years at Harvard. He's an outstanding academic record. At the second last launch of the Endeavour Space Shuttle, he was the official guest of NASA and showed around the entire facility with 2 other guests, Barack and Michelle Obama. When he came out, Michelle Obama came out by herself to South Africa nearly 2 years ago. She personally ran here to accompany her, and he gave the speech in her honor at the US Embassy in Pretoria at a dinner. So in America, he's a superstar. In South Africa, he's an entity. And if anything tells you the difference between American culture and South African culture, it's precisely that Americans celebrate individual excellence. They really let you know that you're special. And we've got one other South African who's in that league. He's called Elon Musk, and he's just developed a tube between San Francisco and Los Angeles, which will get you between the 2 cities at, I think, in half an hour. And the train in the tube will be traveling at 1,200 kilometers an hour. And he was educated at Pretoria Boys High. And yes, he's the founder of PayPal. You know, some of you may use PayPal. He's a South African who made good in the States. And so what I'm trying to say to you is, I bet you have a similar bunch of people in Mauritius. You've got to celebrate them. You've got to absolutely celebrate them, so that other people want to sort of copy them as best they can. So I hope I've persuaded you to become foxes. There is a book, as was said earlier. It's called The Fox Trilogy. It's all 3 of our books, because we've not only written Mind of a Fox, we've written 2 further books to elaborate on our methodology, and it's now called The Fox Trilogy. We have a website called mindofafox.com. What I'd like you to Google, because I don't know what the position is here in Mauritius, is just the word mind and fox, and see whether we're number 1 in Mauritius. Because in America, we are number 1 for those 2 words. Number 2 is Megan Fox. And number 3 is Fox News. So we feel very good about that. It was because of one posting last year. It just shows how powerful the internet is. A risk consultancy in Ohio said, "You want to have a conversation about risk? you must use this conversation model that's on this website. And that one posting went viral in America. And so we're increasingly get American clients who want to use this method of looking out before you look in and considering the scenarios, the flags, the probabilities, and then deciding what you want to do. As far as the global economy is concerned, it's tough. It is tough. We all know it's tough. And you have to have an intelligent strategy. And I've given you some advice on what an intelligent strategy should be in terms of being innovative, living your brand, being the cheaper alternative, but most importantly now looking at those markets with younger demographics, which could grow 3 or 4 times faster than the old world economies. As far as Mauritius is concerned, I think that you're very lucky. You've got an entrepreneurial culture in Mauritius. I've met many foxes here. So in a sense, I'm probably taking coals to Newcastle, as we would say. But you know, you've got to look at the external environment as a company in Mauritius, and then you've got to adapt your strategy to the changes in the external environment. And lastly, I'd like to leave you all in this room with a benediction for you, for your families, and for your businesses. May the fox be with you.
Thank you very much. That was extremely entertaining and very, very interesting. We get to take maybe a couple of questions. Does anybody like to ask any questions here? Yeah, oh, we've got some hands. Well, Ryden.
Claire, thanks very much. A quick 30-second fable before I ask my question. A hungry fox stole into a vineyard to eat some luscious-looking grapes. The grapes, obviously being out of reach, he turned his attention to the chicken coop. At this, all the chickens started saying, sour grapes, sour grapes. So the fox, ashamed, returned to the vines, gave a mighty leap, caught a grape, fell and broke his neck. The grape was sour. You talked about successes. Has there been any case where there's been complete failure, where you totally misread the flags, and then what did you learn from it?
Okay. Probably the biggest failure we had was before I met Chantal, was in our scenario team, where in the late 80s, we were taking quite a negative view of America and its short-term nature. We called it quarteritis, that they're so interested in the next quarter's results. And we thought that this was going to really weigh on their economic performance in the 90s. And we were totally wrong. That America actually had a fantastic decade in the 1990s. And indeed, is still, relative to most other people, performing well. So, yeah, you can get it wrong. But as we say, it's much better to be vaguely right than precisely wrong. And that's what foxes are supposed to be. They don't get everything right, but they get more things right than wrong. And the problem with hedgehogs is that the one idea people, is that they can hit the jackpot if their idea is right, because they're so focused. But they can seriously lose money if they're wrong, because they don't adapt. And so what we're saying to people is, we've got nothing against Jim Collins and Good to Great and his whole chapter on the hedgehog concept, because visionary hedgehogs can, if they've got the idea right, really hit the jackpot. But what we're saying is that every visionary hedgehog should have a little den of foxes around him who are looking at the external environment so that they can adapt their strategy. And if anybody would agree with us, it's Charles Darwin, because he said in Origin of the Species, the most successful species is not the most powerful or largest species, it's the ones that adapt to the changing requirements of nature. They last longer than any other species. We're saying exactly the same for business. But yes, there are examples where the fox gets it wrong. It's just that a fox gets it less wrong than hedgehogs. But they don't make as much money as a hedgehog who gets it absolutely right.
question with regard to China.
Yes.
Do you think that the emergence of a growing and richer middle class in China is going to overcome the threats that you mentioned as far as aging population is concerned? In other words, do you forecast that China is going to go through a growth path that we've seen in the United States over the last 20 or 30 years, where growth is driven by internal consumption because the middle class is going richer, rather than unexposed, which has been the case of China over the last 20 years?
Absolutely. So when I mentioned the demographic cliff, it's more to do with what China's going to face in 15 or 20 years' time. But if you ask me, do I think China will continue to grow at 7.5–8%? The odds on that are much higher than that they will drop into the sort of 5% level. The reason we give a 60% probability to hard times is because Europe, particularly, is really stuck in the 0 to 1% group. And so, yes, I mentioned a few points about China which have just made us reconsider our sort of judgment on the country. But absolutely, they've got 400 million new people in the middle class. It's more than the American population. So, absolutely, they're a $6 trillion economy. I mean, $6.5 trillion economy. I mean, India is a $1.5 trillion economy. So, China's really made it. I mean, it's totally different. There's one aspect to China which worries me, is that obviously with a greater middle class you have greater consumption of resources. And I was given a statistic which I've never verified, but it is that if Chinese ever replicate American lifestyles, we need 4 planets. But we haven't got 4 planets. So I'm not sure exactly what happens in terms of metals and oil and everything else. Because, it's getting quite crowded, this planet. But absolutely right. Internal consumption is going to make up, I think, for any disappointing loss of performance and exports to Europe.
If we follow what you have told us, we might have 4 planets if we need evolution. We might be on Mars and elsewhere. I was going to say I much enjoyed listening to your point about demographics. A big thing, Mauritius, we forget. We don't care about demographics. We seem not to take into account demographics. And the projections of the statistical office are not good at all. So by 2050, fertility rate here, not only the fertility rate is down, but the old age rate is going up. And therefore, the pyramid is being attacked from both sides. And I wonder if sometimes we could govern the scenario for us on our basis.
Yeah, well, sure. If somebody wants me to help them write on that issue of Mauritius, please give Jane a shout. She's my manager. But absolutely, as you say, you're being attacked from both sides. As the people are living longer, but equally, if you have a lower birth rate, your whole population profile changes. And yeah, it just means that you find it more difficult with many industries because of that. And it amazes me that asset managers, people who give you advice on where to invest your capital, don't figure in demographics of a country into their thoughts on which countries to invest in the world. When, as I said, the leading futurist in the world in the second half of the last century, Pierre Wack, said it's probably the most important influence on the medium-term prospects of a country is to look at its demographics.
Any more questions?
Yeah, I'm just wondering whether we should be changing the Chinese calendar and add a year on the box. Yeah, but more seriously, what do you think about climate change? Do you consider that as a serious matter?
Okay, I'll take this as the last question. This is a great question. What about climate change? Have we done work on climate change? The answer is absolutely we've done work on climate change. In 2008, I think it was, I was asked to facilitate a session in London with some of the best climate change experts in the world at the time. 2 American scientists who were the chief advisors to the US Senate, and then the advisor to Tony Blair at the time. And so we had this little group of 10 people, and we wrote 4 scenarios. We called them the pre-Bali scenarios and the post-Bali scenarios. The pre-Bali scenarios, and we had a certain sort of dance theme to everything. The first scenario was called Dirty Dancing. It's where people just went on emitting emissions into, stuck CO2 into the atmosphere. No thought was for the environment. And we obviously thought of many nations, particularly the super emitters, i.e., the big economies who were in the Dirty Dancing category. We then had the different dancers, and the different dancers were people like California at the time and Scandinavian countries who were beginning to scale back on carbon emissions and have laws incentivizing people in order to try and provide an example for the rest of the world to follow. The post-Bali scenarios, we had 2. The first one was called Dances with Wolves. Remember there was a movie called Dances with Wolves with Kevin Costner. And it was essentially where Bali came up with a vaguely worded agreement with no penalties attached, just a kind of, statement of intent. And immediately after the agreement was signed, the wolves cheated. The second scenario was called Strictly Ballroom. It was where a very tight agreement was formulated, where there were specific penalties for not meeting certain targets, and everybody walks in time to the agreement. So then I said to these guys, what probabilities do you give to those 2 post-Bali scenarios? They gave 95% probability to Dances with Wolves and only 5% to Strictly Ballroom. They said, unfortunately, this American, he was very funny, he said, we need 7 damn good hurricanes in a row. He said, if we want to change American opinion on climate change. And it was interesting, I met a young woman who's now part of the MIT faculty, but before that she was in charge of scenario planning of Homeland Security in America. And I said to her, when you did this work at Homeland Security, what were the biggest threats? What did you go to the White House and say to the President? What were the biggest threats? And she had 2. The first one, she said, and this was pre-Boston bombings, was self-radicalization. She said, the terrible thing is, there are no flags for when people cross that line from being, religious fundamentalists to actually being terrorists. And she said that's a huge threat in America because there's really nothing you can do. The second, she said, was climate change. She said, climate change is a huge threat to America because nobody takes it seriously. And indeed, this year, she's been proved exactly right. They've had twisters in America, which have taken out whole suburbs in places like Oklahoma. They've had floods in America and Europe, which have beaten 200-year-old records. They've had the highest temperatures recorded in places like Death Valley in California and places like Arizona, huge fires. In Australia, they beat the record temperature in the centre of Australia in January this year by, I think it was 1.5 degrees or something, and they've introduced a whole new sort of colour. It's called deep purple. It's for places where the temperature is over 50 degrees on a regular basis. So I don't know whether it's due to man-made CO2s in the atmosphere. All I know is that you've got to take it seriously because we've only got one planet. Yes, you can learn how to become an astronaut, or you can have huge air conditioning in your house and never go outside. But, even if the probability is only 10 or 15% that climate change is for real, you've got to take it seriously because of the impact. So, absolutely. In another lecture, I would go into all the flags that are going up on abnormal climatic events. Because I did a book in South Africa with 2 of the best environmentalists there in the late 80s. And they said it's not the gradual climb in temperature which is going to get people. It's the greater frequency of extreme climatic events. That's what's going to really get them. So, absolutely. Anyway, thank you very much, guys, for allowing me to lecture you. Please Fox trilogy is available in South Africa, but just check out mindofafox.com, or better still, just the word mind and fox, and you'll see all about it. Thank you.